Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawati, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, I would like to thank our partners for being with us this evening, MIT, Harvard, and Brown Clubs of Washington, D.C., as well as Columbia University Club of New York. Also, I would like to thank Catherine Hofstadter for being the chief logistic coordinator and liaison for this event. Very honored to have this evening with us Alelia Bundles, Columbia University Trustee Emerita, to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, the first self-made American woman millionaire. And this will be in conversation with Tetiana Anderson, CEO of the Brown Paperback Media. I would like to briefly introduce them, but I would like to encourage everyone to check our website for their unabridged bios and full list of accomplishments. Alelia Bundles is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book that was the nonfiction source for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer, a former network television news executive and producer at ABC News and NBC News. She's a vice chair emerita of Columbia University's Board of Trustees and chair emerita of the board of the National Archives Foundation. She currently serves on the boards of the March on Washington Film Festival, Columbia Global Reports, and the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute. And our host, Tetiana Anderson, currently consults with major corporations, NGOs, foreign governments, and others on all aspects of communications. Before that, she worked as a journalist for 2 decades, during which time she spent extensive time in Middle East and has reported from conflict zones, US presidential races, and more. Her work has appeared on networks including Comcast National Platform, where she currently hosts the public affairs program Newsmakers, also on CNN, CBS Evening News, NY1, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, MSNBC, VOA, and others. She holds a master's degree from Columbia University's School of Journalism and serves as a national board officer from Easter Seals, also hails from the great state of Michigan.
Thank you all so much for coming. And Alelia, thank you to you. I mentioned to her in our sort of pre-conversation that I was so excited to moderate this event because this is sort of a full circle moment for me. I mean, when I went to Columbia, she was kind enough to see me in her office. I know both of our memories are fuzzy on this, but she welcomed me into her office. I was probably looking to network, after completing journalism school or, some years later, and assess my options. But, in talking with me, she shared that she was doing some really extensive work on her great-great-grandmother and that she was going to write a book and she had plans to make a movie. And of course, she's done all that. But fast forward decades later, I ran into the woman who was running Walker's Legacy Foundation, which is also what Alelia is responsible for. She randomly invited me to a holiday party I think you guys were having somewhere north of DuPont and introduced me to the foundation. In 2021, I interviewed the current head of Walker's Legacy Foundation for Comcast Newsmakers, which is a program that I host that Kambiz referenced. And this year, I'm interviewing Alelia, so it's all come together. We have so much to talk about, so little time. I want to remind everyone that Alelia is going to be taking your questions a bit later, but you can share those in the chat feature later. But before we get to that part, I want to turn the floor over to Alelia so she can sort of set the stage for this fascinating discussion. Alelia?
Well, Tetiana, thank you so much. And there are so many of these little seeds that have been planted along the way. And so I am always really happy to hear stories like this. And I'm glad that I made time for you in that office when you wanted to come by, because I would hate to hear that, oh my God, she said she didn't have time for me. So
not at all.
I'm so relieved that was not the case. And Columbia, of course, is particularly critical in this story for me because I began to write about Madam Walker in a serious way when I was a graduate student at Columbia at the journalism school. And we can talk about that a bit later, but I'm really glad to know that there are folks from my undergraduate alma mater who are on this evening from Harvard and Radcliffe, and including my attorney who helped me with a lot of intellectual property work, Ken Kaufman, told me that he was going to be on. So it's really good to have folks from both of my institutions as well as Brown and MIT. So welcome, everybody. One of the things that I really like to do when I'm talking about Madam Walker is do a little bit of background on her, because some people have seen Self-Made, that Netflix series, which Octavia Spencer was great in, but it really doesn't tell Madam Walker's story. And some people have seen Madam Walker mentioned in other places. So I'm just going to do maybe a 10 to 12 minute PowerPoint, but no text, just photos. I'm really lucky to have all of these vintage photos because members of my family save things, but just to give you a little bit of background and hopefully teach a few new things. So, here's the moment of truth, sharing screen, and let's hope that it all works. And there's the other button. Can everybody see the picture of Madam Walker?
Yep.
Okay, great. Excellent. So that's always the exhale moment. So just to give you a sense of Madam Walker's life, people have heard her name. She was an entrepreneur, pioneer of the hair care industry. We now have a new line of hair care products, but she was born in 1867 in Delta, Louisiana, Mississippi River cotton plantation, the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. She was the first child in her family born free. But by the time she died in 1919 at age 51, she was living in Irvington, New York, one of the wealthiest communities in America, in a mansion that she had built as a result of being a pioneer of the modern hair care industry. And because she had created this company that employed thousands of women, thousands of African-American women who otherwise would have been maids and sharecroppers and laundresses, she had become a philanthropist and a patron of the arts. So it was an amazing arc of transformation. In 1917, she held her first convention of her sales agent. So this is I think 2 years before Mary Kay was born. And it had to have been one of the first conventions of women entrepreneurs. This was in Philadelphia. You see her there in the center. To her left is her attorney, F.B. Ransom. To the right is Alice Kelly, the manager of her factory. Uh-oh, I'm hearing an echo. So somebody needs to mute. Okay, there we go. I think the echo's gone away. But anyway, so 1917, she held this convention. And at this convention, again, 2 years before Mary Kay was born, she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products and recruited the most new agents, but also to the women who had contributed the most to charity. And in her keynote speech, she said to them, "I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others." And you can imagine how she had made this transformation from a person who was born on a plantation, very little education, to now leading women and telling them that they were capable of making a difference in society. At the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. And this happened shortly after the East St. Louis massacre in July of 1917. And that was the beginning of the anti-lynching bill that was introduced in 1918 that finally looks like it's going to be passed. So more than 100 years later, but she and people like Ida B. Wells and others were pushing for this legislation very, very early. This is where she was born, in Delta, Louisiana. And you think, oh, she was very conscious of images and the power of images and photographs. And after she had become successful, she made a trip to her hometown and had this photograph taken so that she could show people, she could illustrate for them the journey that she had had. When she was 7 years old, both of her parents died. At 14, she said, I got married to get a home of my own to escape the treatment of a cruel brother-in-law. She had had to live with her sister after the death of her parents. At 14, she married a man named Moses McWilliams, and they had one child, Lelia, who I'm named after, when she was 17. And then when Moses died, she was 20. She knew she wasn't moving back in with the sister and the cruel brother-in-law, but she moved up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where her older brothers had migrated 10 years earlier. And they had become barbers at a time when Black men controlled the barbering trade. And their barbershop was in the Black neighborhood, very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And if you know anything about the AME Church, you know that there was a long tradition of educating African Americans, even during slavery, when it was illegal for enslaved people to read or write. There was an international consciousness among the AME leadership, who tended to be more educated than many of the other denominations. But it was the women of the church who reached out to poor Sarah Breedlove McWilliams, who was a washerwoman, and began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate person. They made sure that her daughter was going to kindergarten. She had a good enough voice to be in the choir. So she aspired to be like some of the school teachers and the more middle-class women, but she really, without a lot of education, that was a struggle for her. But there were people like Jessie Batts Robinson who reached out to her, who was a school teacher and who modeled things for her. The National Association of Colored Women met in her church in 1904. And she could see these women who were doing things internationally, women who were educated. And then around 1900, her hair began to fall out. Now, this was a combination of stress from a second marriage that was really troubled, but also because hygiene was really quite different really before 1950, there were still a lot of people without indoor plumbing. But during this period of time, most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing, didn't have electricity. And so they had horrible scalp infections. She was going bald. And she began to experiment with products. Her brothers had been barbers. And for a while, she sold products that were made by Annie Malone, the woman who would later become her competitor. And then she moved from St. Louis to Denver, where she had a widowed sister-in-law and nieces. Her good friend, Charles Joseph Walker, joined her. He was a newspaper man who knew something about advertising. And she became a cook for a pharmacist. So she had some knowledge. She was experimenting with products. The pharmacist gave her some ideas about how to mix some other products, how to mix some other formulas. She developed her wonderful hair grower, and you can see her hair actually did grow back. It worked, but the wonderful hair grower was a very simple process. Before penicillin, before aspirin, medicine was still pretty primitive, but her key was wash your hair more often with my vegetable shampoo, and then apply this ointment like Vaseline with sulfur that healed the infections on the scalp. Your scalp was healthy, your hair could grow back. By 1910, she was successful. She's in Indianapolis now. She's moved there. She's driving her Model T with her niece sitting next to her, the manager of her factory, Alice Kelly, behind her, and her bookkeeper, Lucy Flint. She was very smart about the people who were in her C-suite, her executive team. That was part of the key to her success. Soon after she moved to Indianapolis, there was a big campaign to raise money to build a YMCA. The YMCAs were segregated, and she contributed $1,000 to the building fund of the Black YMCA. And here she is at the dedication ceremony with Booker T. Washington, who was the main speaker in the center, and her attorney behind her, and the chairman of the board of the YMCA. She built a factory in Indianapolis at one of Booker T. Washington's conventions. When he wouldn't let her talk, she pushed her way to the front on the third day of the convention. And she said, "Surely you're not going to shut the door in my face. I'm a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. And I have built my own factory on my own ground." And so you see this factory that she had built. She's truly come a long way from that shack in Delta, Louisiana. She traveled much of the year recruiting agents. She's here in Ohio with some of her agents, and she was very good about picking women who were leaders. She would give a speech from one town to the next. She'd take out an ad, she'd do a major lecture, really with something like PowerPoint, called a stereopticon, sort of a major speech about Black people in business and education. And then she would put together a smaller group of women and demonstrate her products. And she would see who asked the best questions, who were the women who others gravitated towards, who had leadership abilities, and she would make that person her lead agent. This is Jessie Batts Robinson running the Walker School. So Jessie Batts Robinson had been her mentor, and now she was one of her main agents. Madam Walker advertised extensively in the Black press. She traveled to Central America and the Caribbean in 1913, so she made an international business. She was way ahead of the curve on technology. She's here in 1912 driving a Waverly electric car. So she always was ahead of the curve. Her daughter, Alelia, my namesake, was always her inspiration from the very beginning. As most parents, she wanted her daughter to have a better life. And it was her daughter who persuaded her that they needed to have a presence in New York. The company by now, 1910, headquartered in Indianapolis. Her daughter was running their Pittsburgh office, and her daughter's territory included Harlem. So in 1913, she persuaded her mother to buy the townhouse that you see in the middle. And then they hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to remodel this and to create a double townhouse with the beauty salon on the first floor, the beauty school in the basement, and living quarters upstairs. Here you see the salon and the beauty school. And then in 1916, Madam Walker's health was beginning to fail. She had hypertension, at a time right on the cusp of when some of the treatments for high blood pressure were really just being developed. And she moved to New York, moved her personal residence to New York. The company stayed headquartered in Indianapolis. And then she, after a year or so, decided she needed her own home and hired Vertner Tandy again to build this mansion in Irvington, New York. That's still standing and is a National Historic Landmark. This is the music room. And this just reminds me of how much both women loved music, even when they were poor. Madam was Sarah Breedlove in the choir, but they also were in a town where ragtime was being born. For a while, when they were still very poor, they lived across the alley from Scott Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. They also heard classical music. They heard opera. Madam Walker, after she moved to New York, became very involved in the anti-lynching movement. This is a petition that she and a group of Harlem leaders traveled to New York to present to Woodrow Wilson after this silent protest parade that in protest to the massacre in East St. Louis, 5,000 African Americans marched up Fifth Avenue silently. And it's not unlike the demonstrations that we really saw all over the world after George Floyd's murder in 2020. And when Madam Walker died in May of 1919, she pledged almost $100,000 to various causes and individuals, and she had pledged much more than that before. And then after she died, her daughter Alelia became president of the company. You see her here on the left. The Walker Company continued with conventions in the 1920s, built a new building in Indianapolis in 1927, which is still standing and a National Historic Landmark. And then the company actually never went out of business, but my family was very involved through the 1980s. The trademark was sold to another company that owned it for about 30 years. And then about a decade ago, Richelieu Dennis, the founding CEO of Sundial Brands, bought the trademark. And just a few weeks ago, at the end of January, with Sundial Brands, I have partnered with them and with Walmart to introduce this new line of hair care products. So before we go to questions, I will just give you some of Madam Walker's words. She said that people often asked her the secret to her success, and she would say to them, there is no flower-strewn path to success, and if there is, I have not found it. For whatever success I have attained has been the result of much hard work and many sleepless nights. I got my start by giving myself a start. So don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. You have to get up and make them for yourself.
That's so powerful. And in the course of all that, I've obviously got my video going. So sorry for those troubles earlier, technical difficulties.
It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. So, I mean, I'm just like struck by so many things as I've been preparing for this, because she is such an amazing woman, and it's hard to grasp how she was able to, I guess, dig deep enough to find a motivation to do all of this. And that's what I really want to know. I mean, you know, we see it in her vision for the business. I mean, we see it in the way she expanded it by going from the South to the Midwest, to the West, you know, Indianapolis, New York, you talked about it, Irvington and Harlem, Denver. We see how she trained and uplifted her saleswomen. And I think you had mentioned Mary Kay, and that's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, this is Mary Kay before there was ever Mary Kay, right? She was so ahead of her time, from the meagerest of circumstances, but rose to the highest heights. And I guess I wonder what you have found on your journey researching your great-great-grandmother about her motivation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, just the very basic is a parent wants a child to have a better life. But obviously, a lot of parents want their child to have a better life, and they don't become Madam Walker. But I think there's a combination of, you know, just the, you know, some people are just geniuses. I mean, there is an element of that you have to factor in, that, you know, you see people who create great things, and some of that is just innate. And there's a resilience that she embodied with some of those early hardships in her life. Again, some people can be resilient, they don't become Madam Walker. There are little elements that I believe contributed to this. They don't entirely explain it, but here's some things that I found in the research that you know, made me think she saw a vision through some people who were around her. And that's how we see things. There's somebody around us who's doing something amazing. So her family minister was, you know, had a, you know, sort of a general store in Delta, Louisiana. Delta, Louisiana was almost 90% Black at the end of the Civil War, because it had been such a wealthy cotton producing area, and they needed a lot of Black labor to pick that cotton, to cultivate that cotton. But that then translated during Reconstruction into Black political power. Now, that meant her family minister was a state senator in the Louisiana State Senate. But it also meant that when 1876 election came and there was a backlash and the Ku Klux Klan began to take over, it also meant a great deal of racial violence and terrorism. So her family minister and her brothers were chased out of Louisiana. But her brothers had had some political involvement, but they ended up in St. Louis because of the racial violence. They were older than she was. So by the time she got there, she had seen some leadership, and then the role of the women at St. Paul AME Church and the National Association of Colored Women meeting there. She later would say that it was the National Association of Colored Women who provided the template for her to have her conventions to organize her agents. Mm-hmm. Again, this doesn't entirely explain it, but there is something when you realize that there were mentors and there were role models, that it wasn't entirely just out of her head, that she had seen some other people. And that was, you know, I just sort of wrapped this part up, but just to say, there was so much going on with African Americans in that first and second generation out of slavery, where people were creating institutions like the NAACP, like the National Association of Colored Women, like the National Bar Association. People were starting businesses. So she was benefiting from that, but she still had to have that individual push.
There's so much there, but I'm taking away, if you see it, you can be it. And that really applied to her. She had role models, and that's so important today. I wonder what she would think about what was going on in the world today.
Well, yeah, she was like, why are we just now getting an anti-lynching bill?
I mean, well, you know, to that point, I was thinking about the parallels in her life as a businesswoman that businesswomen have today. I mean, you know, along the way, she dealt with men who didn't want to take her seriously and, you know, didn't want to see her vision. I think Booker T. Washington kind of gave her a non-response when she first tried to reach out to him. People didn't want to give her a chance, which are things that many women today face. what might she say on how far we've come, or maybe how far we haven't? It just seems like we're in the same place, but a different day. But I don't know, what's your perspective?
Well, listen, there's no denying that things have gotten better on many levels. I mean, to see women CEOs, to see women who are very successful in business, who've created their own businesses, who are doing well, but the obstacles are still there. It's still, women have to work twice as hard to, even get to the starting line. And clearly there's the percentage of venture capital that goes to women-led businesses and businesses that are led by people of color is just, it's shameful how little money is invested, even if you have a great idea. But the stories that women entrepreneurs have of going into the room and being, the patronizing questions that they get, somebody saying no, and then they sort of figure out a way, and then they build a $10 billion company from somebody who said, oh no, that's a really bad idea.
Speaking of stories, you did work to write the book. It was translated into a series for Netflix that was huge, and I think it was one of the best series that Netflix had in quite some time when it aired. It got pretty good reviews, lots of enthusiasm around the show, but I know that you had some criticism that you wrote about after the fact. And I'm wondering how much, for those who haven't seen the Netflix series Self-Made, I did watch it, and you should have a look at it. It was very entertaining. But how much was fact? How much was fiction?
Well, I think about 15% was fact. And I wish that I could say more, but here's Octavia Spencer was great. Lots of people worked really hard. Lots of people behind the scenes were so proud to be working on something about Madam Walker. So what was true is that Madam Walker was a businesswoman. Among the things that I liked was that market scene near the beginning where Madam Walker is just trying to convince other women to try the product. So you can see that sort of determination. That part I thought really captured her. But then the producers and the head writer and the showrunners really leaned in on trying to do what I think is kind of a cliched storyline with kind of a cat fight between two women. And while my book was the inspiration, I knew that this was going in a direction I was uncomfortable with pretty early on when I spoke to the head writer, and we were exchanging ideas about what we thought was important. And she said to me she was going to focus on the conflict between Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone. And I said, I think that's an interesting element, but that's not what I would make the centerpiece of the story. And she then tried to make sure that I wasn't part of the conversation with the studios after that. And so, but ultimately they had to let me see the script. And the very first script, I was so shocked because it was Madam Walker and Annie Malone fighting each other, calling each other, bad names, which was just stunning, which would never have happened. And I felt like I really wanted Hidden Figures, and I felt like it was Real Housewives of Atlanta. That said, it's people were inspired by it, but I think we're just a little bit too conditioned to see two women fighting each other. And that Madam Walker story is a story of women empowering each other. You can still have some fictional stuff. You can still make things dramatic and interesting and have conflict. But I personally would not have gone in that direction because it wasn't true.
And I wonder how much responsibility do you think that Hollywood does have to get these stories, especially these stories of, African-American men and women whose stories haven't been told as often as other stories. How much of a responsibility do they have to get it right? Well, especially in the era that we're in today.
I think there's one end of the spectrum that says all Hollywood needs to do is make money. And, whatever we need to do to make money, that's what we're going to do. I think there's another end of the spectrum where people want to have some integrity about the stories they tell. And there are now, thankfully, there are a number of women and people of color, but people who are not people of color, but who get it, who get that it is really important. And I think especially because we're now in a moment where a lot of the stories that should have been told for the last 100 years, since the really racist birth of a nation, that these stories about some of these amazing women and amazing people of color are finally making it to the screen. But unlike Abraham Lincoln, who's had, dozens of films, we're sometimes seeing these people for the first time. And so for me, it's not that it has to be a documentary and everything has to be entirely, to the letter, factual. You don't want to bore people. But I do think that there is something about the core values of the person, the intentions of the person. And I do think that there is a responsibility for that.
Speaking of responsibility and paying it forward and all the things that we've talked about so far, I want to kind of go back to your time at Columbia and ask about Phil Garland, who was one of your professors. She was there while I was at journalism school as well. I vaguely knew her. Talk about how important she was for your journey as a journalist and a writer to have a powerful Black woman like her. There for you.
I mean,
how
absolutely.
did she influence your journey to tell Madam Walker's story?
Well, I mean, and this is the, we cannot underestimate the power of having somebody in the room who has some inkling of your experience. And it's not that, I've had lots of great mentors, and, I've had white guys who are mentors, white women who are mentors. I've had a lot of people who were mentors who, really encouraged me and lifted me up during my career. But in Phil's case, it was someone who knew something more about me than anybody else would know because of the experiences that we'd had. And so when I met with Phil, who happened to be my advisor for my master's paper, I was giving her these, very cliched New York, not interesting topics. And in our conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And I feel pretty sure that Phil knew the answer to that question because her mom had been editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, a very well-known Black newspaper. Phil herself had written for Jet and Ebony. But I think, all the other professors at Columbia would have looked at my weirdly spelled name, A''L, and thought, well, that's interesting or unique or something. But Phil knew to ask that question. And when I said, well, yes, that's my family, she said, that's what you're going to write about. And that was 1975. And it was even more significant because in 1975, there were very few books by or about Black women that were being published. But she had a vision. She could see that if I did this work, that maybe something would come of it, and that I was probably the person in the best position to do that. But if I had not had Phil, maybe I would have gotten around to it eventually. But I would have missed the people who were still alive, and I would have missed her guidance.
We were just talking about Phil, and I was saying that she was one woman who had an influence on you and likely many other. But when you think about your great-great-grandmother, she had such an influence on such a wide array of people, and specifically Black women, about the standard of beauty. Like, she changed the concept of what that was. I'm hoping you can talk about her message on that, because that's such an important thing that, again, we even see today, right?
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's really critical. There are a couple of different elements here. It's just the sort of the basic products that were tailored to Black women's needs and to tailor to the needs of women who didn't have indoor plumbing, who just needed something that would work. So there's that, and helping women grow their hair. So having hair was her issue. But coupled with that, of course, is the European standards of beauty, that there was a great deal of pressure that Black women felt to conform to the European standards of beauty. And there's a long history of, why that is, and people policing other people's hair and not being able to wear your hair out or having to cover it up. And, all of those things that were going on during antebellum times. and that we're still experiencing today with the Crown Act, where women who want to wear their hair natural, many, many more people are wearing their hair natural. Thank goodness that we can be professional, that we can see a woman who is right now undergoing the torture of a hearing to be a justice on the Supreme Court who has natural hair. But the reason that there is the Crown Act that just passed the House, but is stuck in the Senate, is because Black women who wear natural hair have been fired from jobs. Children have been kicked out of school, told they can't be at graduation. So our hair is still something that makes some people uncomfortable, but our natural hair is our natural hair. And we have evolved, but it's still an issue. And so Madam Walker, by giving women products that were tailored for them, helped them make their hair more manageable. She put her own image on the tin of her original product. That was revolutionary for a Black woman to say, this is my hair and this is the way it grows. And to be out front about that, to say there's beauty in the way that we are. But as we go through time, people, this pendulum swings back and forth. People press their hair. She did use the hot comb. People wore their hair natural in the 60s and 70s. The pendulum swung back and it was perms. And now we are at a time when I think there's a lot of diversity. And that's what we've tried to lean into with the new line of products, Madam by Madam CJ Walker, which is healthy scalps make healthy hair, and then styling versatility is an option that women should have.
I want to remind people that you can put questions in the Q&A, and I think that there are already some coming in. But before we get to those, Alelia, I want to ask about philanthropy and your great-great-grandmother. I mean, from her role to raising money to build, the YMCA in Indianapolis, to Walker's Legacy Foundation, which is really an extension of her. She found philanthropy so important. Why did she want to give back so much? Why was that such a priority for her?
But I think because she had been the recipient of the kindness of people when she was struggling. Those women at St. Paul AME really gave to her, and she made sure her daughter had to stay in the colored orphans home because she had to work away from home and she had to leave her daughter there. And she mentioned that many, many times, the kindness of others. And she wanted to make sure that she was giving back. She'd had very little opportunity for formal education. So she wanted to make sure that she was providing scholarships for young boys and girls so they could get an education. And I think she saw that other people were struggling in the same way that she had. And so she gave, whether it was turkeys at Christmas time or whether it was $1,000 to the building fund of the YMCA, that she realized that, she had become prosperous because of other Black people in the community, and she wanted to give back. I mean, she knew that creating hair care products, people wanted hair care products, but what they needed was jobs and education and some way to expand these institutions that they were trying to create. And so philanthropy was very important to her. One of the things that, for me is just so gratifying is when other people tell Madam Walker's story. And I have a good friend, Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who is a professor at Indiana University School of Philanthropy. And Tyrone has really begun to reframe Black philanthropy, the history of Black philanthropy, that you don't have to be a billionaire to be a philanthropist, that philanthropy goes on in our communities and always has, in small ways that don't get recognized. But his book, Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, came out 2 years ago, and he just won a $300,000 history prize because of his work on philanthropy. And so he really does a deep dive on the impact that Madam Walker had.
We're going to get to questions in a minute, but let me remind you to add them to the chat. And to help us out, if you already added a question to the chat, add it again, because with these technical difficulties, I've lost certain things. Before we do that though, Aurelia, are there any last words that you want to share, or thoughts about your great-great-grandmother, or that you learned along the way as you've researched her, or anything?
Well, I think that for me, when I was growing up, my mom was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. And, like most people I knew, Madam Walker had something to do with hair. So, that was the starting point. But it was really when I began to find how much more multidimensional she was, that it was creating jobs for thousands of women, that yes, she became a millionaire, but she was a philanthropist. That she was a political activist. One of my favorite discoveries about her, she and Ida B. Wells were good friends, and Madam Walker began to become more militant politically as she became wealthier. Sometimes people go the other direction. And she and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a Black spy at the War Department during World War I, and they were written up in a documents that said they were Negro subversives. And so I just love the fact that she was militant enough to be included among that group.
Madam Walker must have faced extraordinary hurdles to her eventual success. What were some that come to mind?
Well, not having a lot of formal education. So she really had to overcome that. And she was self-taught, but when she hired Alice Kelly as her manager of her factory, Alice Kelly was a former dean of girls at a Black boarding school. So in some ways, she was a private tutor for her. Being a woman in these spaces was very difficult. I didn't tell the long version of the story with Booker T. Washington, but when she went to his convention, she wasn't part of his inner circle, and she had to push forward. But to her credit and his credit, by the time he died in 1915, they were friends. And when you saw them in that picture at the dedication of the YMCA, he praised her, and he was a guest in her home. She sent her chauffeur to pick him up, and he stayed in her home, even though he had dissed her a year and a half earlier. Just traveling. I mean, it was a segregated travel, Jim Crow cars, and she still pushed forward. She was really determined. So, those were the obstacles of that era.
Okay, where are her personal papers kept? Are they accessible to the public? Are there many writings?
Yeah, they're Madam Walker's papers. Fortunately, this is another reason why I think she is more remembered than some of her competitors, because of her C-suite, the people she surrounded herself with, her attorney, F.B. Ransom, her secretary, Violet Davis Reynolds, who started working for her as a teenager, was still working for the company in the 1970s. She was my neighbor, but she carefully preserved those papers, and we donated the papers to the Indiana Historical Society, which has now digitized the papers. So we, are very fortunate that there are very few women-owned and Black-owned businesses that have the body of records and documents and photographs, but they are digitized, and so they are available.
Your family has done a wonderful job of preserving images of Madam Walker. How much insight into her personality was passed down as well?
Well, we did not sit around the dining room table talking about Madam Walker. I will tell you that. And I mean, that was intentional. My mother was the fourth generation of women in her family to be an executive at the company. And she did not want to, make it mandatory that me or that my brothers felt that an obligation. But I watched what she did. I would go with her to her office. I saw her preparing for board meetings. And so I knew that there was this building that my mother went to, and I could see the importance of that. The idea that I'm able to tell the story is something that makes me very proud. But I think for me, it's even more important that it inspires others.
As a darker-skinned African-American woman, one of my takeaways was the role C.J. Walker played in marketing her line of products to all Black women of all shades and with all hair textures, while her quote-unquote lighter-skinned competitor tapped into colorism to market her product. How much of that was fact?
Zero. That is one of the things that really bothered me about the series, that Madam Walker and Annie Malone were both, really successful women, both employed lots of women, both were philanthropists, but skin color had nothing to do with their competition with each other. That was really, as they would say, a conceit of the head writer who wanted to introduce the theme of colorism into the series. And so in her desire to create this kind of competition and catfight between two women, she created that. That really wasn't true. It's not that colorism wasn't an issue, but it was not the source of the competition between those two women. So that bothered me, because just as the person who asked the question has now been led to believe that that was the source of it. And that's what bothers me about the series, that people now believe a version of history that's not true.
So many questions here. Did Madam Walker have any connection to the Harlem Renaissance or any of the intellectuals and writers that were part of that movement? She sounds like she lived in that geographic center, and she did. She was in Harlem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you sort of when does the Harlem Renaissance start? So that, people differ on that. Some people say it started in 1921 with Shuffle Along. Some people say it started in 1919 when the soldiers, the 369th, came back from the war. Some people say it started earlier when the center of the Black population in New York began to move up from 53rd Street up to Harlem. I would say when A'Lelia Walker persuaded her mother in 1913 to buy this townhouse in Harlem, that is when Harlem was becoming the political and cultural mecca of Black America. And so there were people who were part of that wave during the teens, whether it was James Weldon Johnson, his brother, J. Rosamond Johnson, Fred Moore, who was the publisher of the New York Age, some of the other, Burt Williams, Ada Overton Walker, some of the musicians and theater people who I think were kind of that early wave of the Harlem Renaissance, even though most people think of the Harlem Renaissance as the 1920s. But Madam Walker certainly knew those people. She was very friendly, and she and A'Lelia Walker were early patrons of music. Whenever you saw the music room in the mansion, the same thing was true of the house in Harlem. Whenever they had a party or a dinner, there was live music, and they were very tapped into that, and also very much involved in the politics. Madam Walker was speaking out on behalf of the treatment of Black soldiers. So yes, she absolutely knew many of the people who would later become known as being part of the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, A'Lelia Walker was a central figure of the Harlem Renaissance. The townhouse in New York, one floor of that was converted into the Dark Tower, which was a salon, a cultural salon. Her apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the house in Irvington were sort of the iconic parties. Now, I will just add this. I'm almost finished with the first major biography of A'Lelia Walker, who is horribly and inaccurately portrayed and self-made. But I'm doing this because the same inaccurate paragraph about her is written over and over again. And she is much more a patron of the arts than she's been given credit for in most of the things that have been written about the Harlem Renaissance.
Well, I have a question about her, and I'll ask it later because I want to keep to the participant questions. There is a question about creativity. Was Madam Walker left or right-handed? And as a creative, did she have any traits considered eccentric?
I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. What a great question, but I don't know.
It is a great question. I wanted to know the answer myself. This can be another book.
Right.
Would you recommend a visit to Villa Lewaro when it opens for public visitation? And are there additional sites that you would recommend?
So Villa Lewaro is not going to be a public venue. I mean, it is. There will be from time to time, perhaps some public events, but it's now owned by a foundation that was created by Richelieu Dennis, the founding CEO of Sundial Brands. And it is undergoing some renovation. So the previous owners did a lot of work on it, but it's, a house more than 100 years old, so there's always work to do. But it will become a meeting place for women of color entrepreneurs who go through the New Voices Fund, which is a venture capital fund that Richelieu Dennis and his family created after the sale of their company to Unilever. But the village of Irvington, which has to zone things and approve things, that is really not interested in having the house become a major venue. There was a big fashion show last summer that was, quite large, and the village was not all that excited about that. And so they really do not want it to be a place that will be a real public venue. But from time to time, there will be some small events.
I wanted to ask you actually about Aurelia. She's a fascinating character on her own. Was extremely well traveled. I think in 1922, I read she went to a variety of cities, France, London, Cairo, Rome, did Addis Ababa. She was a real patron of the arts. As you mentioned, music was front and center in the family. Give us a little bit of more insight into who she was and her struggle and her story.
Sure. Well, it's really been I've got a really long journey in finishing this book about her, because I had to just really excavate from different sources, from her letters, from newspaper articles, from her divorce records, from all kinds of things. But the key thing is she's Madam Walker's daughter, which will always be overshadowing. But she was her own person who had her own interests, very much enjoyed the arts, loved music, loved beauty, was kind of an impresario. She knew how to do events. She staged huge events. Now, my grandmother's wedding in 1923 was this big, they called it the $1 million wedding. It didn't really cost $1 million, but she was very meticulous about the clothing, about the bridesmaids, about the food, about all of the things that went along with it. She traveled, as you said, in 1921, 1922 to Paris, London, Monte Carlo, Rome for the coronation of the Pope, Cairo, Addis Ababa, where she met with the Empress. She was a glamorous person. When she was in Rome, at the coronation of the Pope, the Italian newspapers wrote about just what a flamboyant, beautifully dressed person she was. So she's a complicated person. It's hard to be the child of a larger than life figure, but her way of trying to, make a contribution and have her own identity was to be a patron of the arts.
There's a question in the chat, and it says, I have a friend who in her dissertation used Madam Walker as an early example of combining business with adult education. Can you talk about that as a specific focus of the training provided to new associates?
I love that question because it's so true. And it's something I would love to see that dissertation, but it's something that my friend Tyrone McKinley Freeman leaned into in his book, Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving. And while I talk about Madam Walker creating these beauty schools, giving Black women diplomas, training them, I didn't go deeply into that, but it is this adult education at a time when most Americans didn't even really finish high school. She was giving Black women a credential, training them, helping them to feel like leaders, but they had to, it's a 6-week course. You had to learn something, you had to study, and then you had a credential that made you a leader in your community, to the point where these women would, they were doing hair. Maybe they were doing hair. Maybe they had a beauty shop. Maybe they were, as we say, kitchen beauticians, but they were making enough money that they could invest in real estate. The women Tiffany Gill, who's a good friend, who's a professor at Rutgers, did additional research on the next generation of beauticians, the next 2 or 3 generations of beauticians. They, with this seed planet of activism, the beauticians helped to pay for the buses that took people to the March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph's wife, Lucille Green Randolph, was a Walker-trained beautician. So there was this synergy between politics, and business. And this education of women went along with being a Walker agent.
When did the granddaughter die, and did you meet her?
So my grandmother, May, so Madam Walker, then Alelia Walker was her daughter. Alelia Walker was married 3 times and had no biological children, but adopted my grandmother, May. And in my research, I discovered that they had known May's uncle when they lived in St. Louis. They went to the same church. And when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis, May's grandmother lived across the street from her. So there was a family connection before. And then May's father had died a couple of years before Madam Walker arrived in Indianapolis. And they had sort of taken in other young people, but decided to legally adopt her. And she traveled as a model. She had very long hair, very long braids. And Madam Walker's main product was wonderful hair growers. So May appeared on the advertisements and she traveled with Madam Walker. Madam Walker demonstrated the products. But May died in 1945 when my mother was a freshman at Howard. So I never met May. I was born a little later than that.
One of the audience members makes more of a comment here, but I think it's pretty interesting. He's talking about, although Madam Walker was a member of the AME Church, the initial organizing for the 1918 Silent March on Fifth Avenue in New York took place at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem under the rectorship of somebody I'm not going to go into here, but then he goes on to say that he suspects that Madam Walker provided a large part of the funding for the march, and notes that this was sort of a major civil rights event that took place long before 1963, in which, you know, Martin Luther King, obviously, and rightly so, is remembered for, but he's, or she, I don't know who this is coming from, is equating the fact that, again, she's ahead of her time and is involved in civil rights activities. I mean, was she a funder of that? Do you know?
Well, she contributed money. I can actually see the question. And yes, no, it's okay. So much did happen at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And another sort of connection is that Vertner Tandy, as this person probably knows, the same architect who did St. Philip's also was the person who designed Madam Walker's 2 New York houses. And St. Philip's was it was a key place for organizing so much. But there's actually a list in, I think, the New York Age that says how much money individuals gave. And I can't remember what the amount Madam Walker gave, but I think a key role for her is that she was on the NAACP, the New York chapter's executive committee, which was one of the key organizers of that march up Fifth Avenue.
As I was reading the book, it's very inspiring, you know, to just read about a woman who made such an incredible legacy. I don't know if she expected to do this. I mean, it's one of the things I think about is how much insight you do get into her character and who she was. And it's back to this person's question, you know, earlier that you couldn't answer. But what do you feel sort of in your heart that you really have learned about this woman and who she was as a person, you know? Because you get a feeling after a while, you're researching a spirit, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, listen, and I will say there's always something as a biographer that you wish you could have, you know, like not just the hour conversation, but the long week at a spa. so you could ask all the questions. The things that I would love to know, what was that experience of losing her parents at 7 years old? And then that next decade when there had to have been a wilderness of just drudgery and no hope, and how she pulled herself out of that. But I think, you know, now I've actually been doing this almost 50 years of studying her and having a sense of her. And I still get new revelations. And again, when people like Tyrone McKinley Freeman write books, and I have the opportunity to, there are just a few people who have delved into this as deeply as I have, but it is a joy to me to be able to have a conversation with them because they point out things that I may not have thought about, what she was going through. I think within the last year or so, as I've been telling the story a lot, it was the revelation for me that the hair care products were important. They were revolutionary at the time, but this sense that she knew that what these women needed was education, and what they needed was economic independence, because there were so few doors open to Black women. And some of that just comes from telling the story over again, listening to things. But there are two quotes from her ad. She did that before and after picture that I showed early on. She used that in an ad, and it was as effective as a Jenny Craig commercial. Where you see it before and after, like it really does work. But she used testimonial letters like Jenny Craig, and two letters that stand out for me. One is that it was about her products. And a woman wrote to her and she said, "Before I started using Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower, my hair was 1/8 of an inch long. And now it is down my back, and I've been able to throw my wig away." And then the other comment that stands out for me is a woman saying to her, "You have made it possible for a Black woman to make more money in a day selling your products than she could in a month working in somebody's kitchen." Now that's, for me, profound, because there's a woman who now is her own businesswoman. She's buying a house, she's educating her children, and she's not beholden to somebody else who's going to treat her badly. That sense of independence and economic freedom is critical.
We have another comment. Speaking of Black hair, I want to say that I love both of your hairstyles. I wanted to read that for everybody. Thank you.
Yours is gorgeous.
Likewise, yours is always gorgeous. On the hair issue, are the ingredients, the recipe of all the hair products still the same?
No, because we have 100 years worth of research and development. But Madam Walker's original hair formula for Wonderful Hair Grower was a really basic hair formula that had been around for centuries. So neither she nor Annie Malone were the first ones to create it. Cuticura actually was very similar and had been around before them. But it was this combination of a vegetable shampoo, unlike the lard, the sort of animal fat based shampoos that many people had used before. So that was revolutionary, to have a vegetable based shampoo. And then this sort of basic formula of what was called petrolatum, but it was really what we know as Vaseline with sulfur. And sulfur is a centuries-old remedy for healing skin and scalp infections. So those two products together were revolutionary in 1906. But as as you look on products, you see that, shampoos, no sulfate. So that was sulfur. Now people don't use that. The heavy petroleum-based products, most people have gotten away from that. And so what has happened with these new formulas is this century of technology and science, and all of the research that's been done on textured hair and strengthening textured hair. So that's what's really in these new products. There's a serum for scalp dryness. There's a serum for split ends because so many people have frizzies. There's one ointment called balm to oil that kind of imitates the original product in consistency, but it doesn't have the heavy, petrolatum.
What's your hair regime?
So my hair regime is, of course, I'm using these products, and which are new, and so I'm still, doing the combination. There are 11 products, but my regimen is I wash my hair with Madam by Madam C.J. Walker, and there's a leave-in conditioner, and I have been using that. There's also a cream styling product that I've used. And I like the serum, the scalp serum, because it keeps your scalp moisturized. And then when I need a little refresh, I use that cream, but I've also been using the the balm to oil product. Now there's also a braid spray. I don't have braids, so I'm not using that.
Okay.
And I have, there's also a gel, and I tried the gel on my hair. It doesn't work for me, but that's, everybody has a slightly different texture.
Yeah. Fascinating. One person is saying that one thing that strikes this particular person is about how Madam Walker was learning and how her learning might have inspired your own leadership in philanthropy. Have you reflected on this? And then thank you for the pioneering work you've done, both in your book and in your talks, and even, yes, in the volunteer work you've done for your alum. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say that long before I knew the details of Madam Walker's life, I had parents who were community leaders and who really were my direct role models in the way that you should show up in the community. So, my mom was president of the PTA. She worked at the Walker Company. She was on the school board in our suburban township in Indianapolis. My dad was a businessman as well, and was the founding president of an organization called Center for Leadership Development that provided mentoring for African-American students in Indianapolis. So I had role models who showed that service was very important. And, the volunteer work that I do, and especially with Columbia and with Harvard, it has, really grew out of my desire to have connection with people who I enjoy being around. And I had one little, sort of key piece for me is that there are times when in my career, like I had a really great career. I'm really happy with my 30 years in network television news, but like anybody who works long enough, you hit roadblocks. And there were times when I was somewhat frustrated in my career, but I found an outlet with volunteering with alumni activities and was allowed to have some leadership roles. And so those things have really contributed to each other.
Where can you buy the products?
At Walmart. They're in 3,000 Walmart stores. So you can buy them at Walmart and you can buy them at walmart.com. And on my website, AleliaBundles.com, there's a link to the Madam by MCJW.com website that will explain the products.
Okay, well, people are asking for it in the chat. I don't know.
All right, I'll see if I can put that. I'll try to put that in there. Let me find that link and I'll type it in. Okay.
One person is asking about the sort of Madam C.J. Walker brand, which I thought about, like her brand marketing was, and you touched on it earlier, was just absolutely incredible. I mean, if she would have had social media, like that would have been insane, right?
Yeah, she would definitely have been. Now, do I put it in the chat or in the Q&A?
Put it in the Q and wait, I don't know, Canvas.
I'll put them in both places.
Put it in the, yeah.
Yeah, she would have definitely been all over Instagram and TikTok, no question.
I'm going to ask another question. You grew up knowing that you were the descendant of Madam C.J. Walker and that your mother worked for the company. When did you actually realize how important she was to the African community and to history? When was that sort of aha moment?
Yeah, so here's the deal. My mother, as I think I said earlier, she intentionally did not make it a big deal because I think she had tons of pressure growing up, a lot of expectations. Now, I think she wore it well, but she did not really want me to feel that I had to do, essentially the family business, that I was really encouraged to do what I loved, which was writing, and which led to my career in journalism. But there were things I knew that there was something different about my family, in the sense that the silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. And there was, and my mom went to an office where there was a factory, and she had, so she was a businesswoman. So I knew there was that, and I didn't know anybody else who had a building, a block-long building that was named after their great-great-grandmother. So, clearly there was something different. but it was not something that was, that was overwhelming or oppressive for me. And it was, and to the point where I really played it down. That's why when Phil said to me, do you have a connection to Madam Walker, to Lillia Walker? And I said, well, yeah, that's my family. Well, I wasn't going like, yay. I was just like, okay, yeah, well, that's my family. But it was really Phil who in some ways validated it and gave me permission to try to find another door in.
I want to ask about Walker's Legacy Foundation. What gave you that idea? What's a brief history? What does it do?
So, I really have to give Natalie Cofield the credit for coming up with that. I mean, Natalie, who's now at the Small Business Administration, a little more than a decade ago, when Natalie was in DC, a young entrepreneur, looking for mentors. And one of the things that she did was to approach the DC Office of Women's Affairs and say, I want to do events. And she hosted monthly luncheons, and I was her first speaker, and she wanted to call it Walker's Legacy. And I was, at that point, there weren't, I'd written a book, but there weren't a lot of things that were going on. And I thought Natalie just had, so much drive and so much enthusiasm that I was really happy to be supportive of that. And that it's turned into a wonderful group. Era Scales is now running it, and they're inspiring lots of women on all kinds of levels.
Actually, that's so funny because Natalie is the one who I met randomly several years ago in DC. We were both at some women's conference and we were both in the bathroom. And I think we were like the only women of color at whatever event was happening here. And she was like, hi. And I was like, hi. And she was like, let me tell you about, Walker's. And I was like, okay. And she invited me to the Christmas party. So I went and I found out. I'm actually, for the audience, I'm going to put the link to the interview I did with Era Scales on Walker's Legacy Foundation in the chat, because if you want to know more about that, it's a great, 5-minute overview. And it's just such an important organization. I think that would be fantastic to share if you wanted to look at that later.
Right, absolutely. Support it, definitely.
Well, yeah, I hope you don't mind my shameless plug for your
absolutely, please do.
So what are you doing now? I mean, you have so much on your plate. Where are you currently?
So I am editing the last 7 chapters of this first major biography of Lillia Walker, which I can't wait to get out in the world. On Thursday, I'm going to Las Vegas for the Black Enterprise Women of Power Summit, and I'm being honored with a Legacy Award, and really excited about that. I mean, I guess this is when you get older, you get these kind of awards. So I'm happy about that. I'm on some nonprofit boards, which I enjoy, but I will tell you that when I finish this book, the thing that I want most is to be able to travel, assuming COVID is not keeping us from totally traveling, to read books and to think. That is what I really want to do, is to have time to think and not be obligated to be doing things.
Speaking of travel, Madam C.J. Walker was incredibly well-traveled, which was not necessarily typical of the time, especially for Black women. Talk to us about some of the most, memorable trips that she made and what she left with those societies. I'm sure it was striking to see a woman like her for many people.
Right. Well, I think the trip in 1913 to Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Panama, and Costa Rica, that had to have been amazing. And, there's a little interesting connection between the cultural folks and the business folks, because during that period of time, the most well-traveled African-Americans were entertainers, whether it was Burt Williams or Williams and Walker or Ada Overton Walker. They were on the road and they were the ones who knew their way around. And when Madam Walker made her first trip or the one trip to the Caribbean, it was with a Black opera singer who had been there before. So she benefited from that. The travel across the United States, she traveled to California to, some of it was on the train, some of it was in cars, but really all over the United States. And I don't know that she visited every single state. I'm not sure she was in North Dakota or Idaho, but she was in a lot of places. And I think that it was, she was expanding her mind. She wanted to see these places. She was as interested in the tourist, the sort of the natural beauty of the national parks as she was in what was going on in the cities. And with this travel, again, it was Jim Crow. It was an era of segregated travel. But the Black Pullman porters really took pride in making sure that they found a way to make her comfortable. So there was like a little bit of that underground support that was going on.
Well, I wanted to know, is there any sort of last thoughts or words of advice or encouragement or anything that you want to share with us, or anything at all?
Just typing in my Twitter and Instagram handles.
We need to know how to buy the products. We need your Twitter, your Instagram, your website. No, seriously.
Tetiana, I thank you so much for these great questions, and thank you to everybody who's asked questions and is curious enough to learn. I mean, I feel grateful that I'm able to share this story. And I will say that in particular in this moment, I was watching the hearings earlier today with Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm so proud of how she handled herself. We are in this moment where we can see how much things have changed, but we also see this incredible backlash to telling our stories. And when I was in high school, the only time Black people were mentioned in my textbook was as slaves, not enslaved people, which is what we say now. And were described as contented and better off as slaves because they were clothed and fed. And so I am a crusader for telling the truth about history. Our stories are our power. And that's what I do every day.
So I take it to mean we're going to see another actual movie that maybe more so reflects Madam.
I hope so. I am moving in that direction.
Just guessing. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. This is recorded and it will be available online in about 24 hours if you wanted to watch it again.